Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Alaster Love, who's the Vice President of Oil and Gas at Transplace. And today we're going to talk about big data and analytics for oil and gas transportation. Now, when you hear the terms, big data and analytics, you usually think about, retail, CPG, applying big data and analytics on the consumer side of things. You wouldn't necessarily think about it for transportation, perhaps, or even for oil and gas. But the oil and gas industry is beginning to get a lot more attention these days for a variety of different reasons. And that's something that we're going to be exploring today with Alaster and talking about, why is oil and gas getting a lot more attention today, and more specifically, what's the role of big data and analytics, particularly from a transportation standpoint, in helping to move that industry up the maturity curve from a supply chain logistics standpoint. So, very happy to have Alaster on the program. Just want to remind you that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational. So if you are joining us live today, and you want to ask a question, you can do so via the submit a question button or via the chat feature. And I'll keep an eye on that. And certainly, if it's a good and appropriate question, I'll try to weave that into the conversation. Just a reminder that if you are joining us today as a visitor, you will have to sign in first before you're able to ask a question. So with that, Alaster, welcome to the program.
Thank you for the invitation, Adrian.
So Alaster, like I do every week when I have a new guest on the program, I always like to find out, how they got involved in supply chain and logistics. So why don't you kind of briefly tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved in supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at Transplace.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Sort of a circuitous route in terms of oil field logistics. I am originally from North Texas and have family who has long been involved in the oil and gas industry. I worked on supply chain consulting projects in Brazil years ago for the national oil company there. Came back to the United States in the late 90s for an MBA. Focused on an international trade path and found that the Texas A&M International University in Laredo had an up-and-coming program, and it made a lot of sense to me because of the fact that Laredo crosses between 6,000 to 8,000 trucks a day. Graduated successfully from that program, and as part of my MBA program, started with an internship at one of the largest truck brokers in the United States. They asked me to move to Miami after graduation, and lo and behold, I was assigned an account development process with the National Oil Company for Venezuela. So I'd left Texas to go to Florida, really thinking that I would do something different, and was back in the oil patch, albeit was Venezuela. Fast forward 10 years, I last led the oil and gas projects in marine logistics commercial area for the largest freight forwarder in the world in the North American space. That was focused really on air, ocean, customs, marine logistics, husbandry, crew change, and projects. At the same time, living in Laredo, I started to see the proliferation of massive amounts of trucking to support the Eagle Ford Shale. And one day as I woke up to get on a plane to go somewhere in the Middle East, I thought, why are you going all this way when there is the domestic oil field that is in some ways more ripe for solutions in terms of trucking. And thankfully was able to find a place with Transplace, who was very interested in pursuing oil field.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a long history there in the oil and gas industry, particularly in the oil side of things, as you just talked about there. And you're right. I mean, there is so much focus now these days on the domestic production of oil and gas that's really, as I mentioned earlier, casting attention on this industry like never before. But going back, if you go back a few years, I kind of joked that, if you were in an industry other than kind of CPG and retail, you really weren't getting a lot of love from the press or the analysts, because, a lot of the focus has been on things like omni-channel commerce, on same-day delivery, e-commerce, so on and so forth, which is still kind of, topping the headlines today. But in reality, supply chain logistics executives in other industries, face their own set of unique challenges and opportunities. And oil and gas is a perfect example. So why don't we begin there? I mean, what are some of the key logistics trends and challenges in the oil and gas industry today?
Well, great question. The challenges are very different for what is offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, and then what is onshore in the major shale plays in South Texas, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, and West Texas. Probably the best place to start is offshore. The challenge there being the cost of operation, and when they need the material on a platform or a drill ship, they really, really need it. The cost of operating in the Gulf of Mexico can be as high as $500,000 a day for various pieces of drilling equipment and support, and of course employs literally thousands of people to support each offshore rig. My focus has really been onshore in the United States, and what changed the game was fracking. So for those of you who may or may not be familiar with fracking and why it's changed the logistics industry, basically it comes to this. It requires about 2,500 trucks of sand, chemicals, and production water per individual well. That's what changed the logistics piece of onshore in the United States. That with the prolific amount of volume, drilling volume, that had never been seen in this country.
Now, that volume, when you talk about the 2,500 trucks, is that how frequently is that being? How frequent are the deliveries of that sand, of those chemicals, of that water?
Great question. So, the oil field industry, bar weather, doesn't stop. That's 24/7, 365 days a year. That could be Christmas. That could be Easter. It doesn't stop. And part of the industry challenge has been staffing to be able to service those requirements.
Now, when you look at, relative to other industries, I mean, how would you characterize the kind of the maturity level of oil and gas, of their in terms of logistics capabilities and sophistication? And is it different kind of upstream versus downstream?
Great question. Probably working back, my feeling is that the downstream space is very mature. And if we were to go from a 1 to 10 scale, maybe call it an 8 or 9. For a variety of reasons, their dock-to-dock, inclusive of lubricants and chemicals, I think has been much studied. Their margins are lower. It's not a 24/7 activity in most places, and pretty mature. Midstream is an entirely different discussion. Midstream, which for me is really construction of pipelines and infrastructure, again, had not seen the volume that we've seen in the last 5 years, probably in the history of the industry in the United States. The construction companies and infrastructure companies who work with engineering and procurement construction companies generally have very well-staffed logistics departments who are very capable. But I think the challenge has been for everybody getting equipment. So, maybe a little bit more towards the middle of the road there, maybe a 5 to 6. And then upstream, I think you have to really step back and look at individual market segment. Oil field tool manufacturing is probably a little bit more mature, because a lot of that tends to be dock to dock. The service space is mature in terms of logistics, centralized logistics management when you're in the top tier of providers. As you work your way out of that first tier, it drops off in terms of maturity. The drilling companies really have never had much of a need to spend a lot of time and focus on organizing themselves logistically. And so those companies traditionally have not had very large and mature logistics departments. So it's really pretty different when you get into the downstream, midstream, and then you subdivide by area in the upstream scene.
Yeah, no, it's great points there. I mean, it really is, when you, as you kind of highlighted there, you're really talking about different different types of supply chains that really make up the the whole industry, right? And I think the other interesting thing is that what happens in oil and gas actually has this ancillary effect where other industries are impacted as well. I know in talking to a lot of logistics executives in other industries, such as chemicals, for example, they're having a hard time finding equipment because a lot of the equipment and a lot of the drivers are kind of working for the oil companies or the gas companies, so it's exacerbating, the capacity issue and the driver issue in those industries, because of the impact that, the increased volumes in oil and gas is having. Are you hearing that or seeing that as well?
Absolutely, especially in a place like South Texas. Laredo, where I'm from, has between 6,000 and 8,000 trucks a day that cross, and a lot of the large intrastate carriers, I think, have had a very difficult time in retaining their driver base and recruiting new drivers. I think it's even more challenging when you get to places like Pennsylvania and North Dakota to maintain a driver base. And the oil field, really the drivers do extremely specific things. And so there's some drivers that drive hot shots only a couple hundred miles, but they work on a 24/7 basis. There's people who are involved in moving rigs, who work with winch trucks and pole trucks, and they really work as a team to get the job done, whether that be a 24-hour period or a 48-hour period. It's a very interesting space, and I know that the oil field is challenged in finding drivers. I was in Midland this week, and there are scores of advertisements for CDL drivers who can really pick the company and the opportunity. So it's really changed the way that the oil field industry works, and I think very specific regions.
Now, do you see? I mean, it was just in the over the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of press around the falling price of oil, right? And I guess OPEC is having a meeting, on Thanksgiving, which a lot of analysts are looking at in terms of what to do there, what they might do. So basically, you're seeing the price come down of oil, and you've got some analysts that are saying it could go down as much as to $50, a barrel. Any thoughts on kind of what impact, if the current trends are with the oil prices continue in terms of a downward slope? Is that going to have an impact on the, from the supply chain, logistics, transportation standpoint? What impact is that going to have?
I think that's a very interesting question. And if we go back to the upstream side of the business, in that 2,500 trucks that I referenced, the majority of those are specialized equipment, pneumatic trailers for sand, and vacuum trucks for production water and chemicals. Each of those trailers are very expensive to buy and to maintain, and so as the price comes down, we imagine that equipment will be even harder to source in specific regions, because the cost of the trucking company maintaining and buying more is really expensive. It's a pneumatic trailer costs about 20 times more than a dry van, and of course has to be maintained as they're working off-road in extremely challenging environment, and they have to be maintained quite regularly. The hotshot fleet in the United States, and again, this is everything from a pickup truck to a little flatbed reverse gooseneck, something like that. Those numbers, I fear, could follow off and have an effect on those companies that have bought and maintained that equipment. And so we'll have to see. We don't have enough drivers. We don't have enough equipment. And there's severe strain on capacity and price for the most specialized equipment in specific regions. So it could be that it holds in certain regions the demand and supply, and in others it backs off a little bit. We also have what is reform for the energy sector in Mexico. They plan to frack certain fields, and they will pull from U.S. capacity because for a large part that specialized equipment doesn't exist in Mexico, nor is the carrier base sufficient to do that work.
Yeah, interesting. A lot of different factors at play there, and certainly we'll have to keep an eye on what happens with the oil markets, and since it is a global market, right, and see what impact that ultimately has on transportation and logistics operations. So let's talk now about kind of big data and analytics. Again, like I mentioned, a lot of the conversation today with big data and analytics tends to be focused on retail and CPG, but how does it apply to oil and gas, and specifically in transportation and logistics, and what value and benefits can it provide?
Yeah, great question. And I think when we really started in this space, we were surprised by some of the due diligence and initial questions we had of the largest in the industry. And generally, one of the first questions was, what is your trucking spend in North America or even just the United States? And some don't know because they don't have a centralized logistics platform, and these efforts have been led from the field. And so, of course, they can't use the economy of scale, but they simply don't have vision to how many trucks are moving on a certain day in a specific geography or a specific region. So big data, analytics, technology was not part, generally speaking, of oilfield logistics or trucking in the past, but I think there's a lot of industry in need by the biggest in the industry to grab a hold of that business intelligence and start to optimize, benchmark, and use economy of scale.
So it sounds like, really, going back to my previous question about, kind of the maturity level that they're at, it sounds like really, there's a great need to kind of build that foundation, that visibility foundation in terms of understanding, getting visibility to their transportation spend in terms of, their volumes, their carrier relationships, so on and so forth, to kind of build upon that, to then kind of be able to do more sophisticated things like optimizations and so forth. Is that a fair summary of kind of what you just said?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating to me because the largest of the large have trucking spends in the continental USA that are over $500 million. You have what some would consider small service companies that spend $10, $20, $30, $40 million in trucking easy. And so the spend alone is enough reason for most of them to do what I call, which is big, so turn on the lights. Let's Let's give you the data. Let's give you the analytics so that we can do what we do in the supply chain industry with that.
You know, kind of related to that, I mean, particularly with big data and analytics and visibility, you know, there's a lot of talk these days also around kind of, you know, companies taking a control tower approach to, you know, managing their logistics operations. I would assume that this is also, you know, applicable in the oil and gas industry too, and kind of what are the key enablers to kind of enable that control tower approach?
It is very applicable. The enablers are different, and again, we probably have to go back to industry-specific segments. Control towers generally in the operating and exploration and production space are subdivided into geographies just because of their need to operate on a 24/7 basis. It's pretty challenging to have one single control tower that would be able to monitor and manage transportation for a geography that is literally thousands of miles away and might have very different weather conditions and capacity. The enablers, of course, are data, a desire to work from a common platform. Change management is a big part of that internally with some of these companies. Some of these companies have different versions of ERPs. Some of them have some of the largest household names in terms of ERPs. Some of them have homegrown ERPs. So data, the ability to connect, the desire to connect, and internally within these organizations, the ability to mandate that this is for the better good of the organization.
So do you see, I would assume that, you know, a transportation management system, a TMS, is kind of another key enabler, you know, as part of this. Are there any industry-specific capabilities that are required as part of a TMS to, facilitate a kind of a control tower approach?
Not so much an industry-specific requirement. I think that it's a different discussion because it involves finance, supply chain, logistics, regional management, and purchasing. I think the biggest internal buzz or need is a desire to really capture the information and create a sustainable logistics path. What I mean by that is a large company says that they need to grow by 3 to 5%, and they need to have the transportation capacity to do so. And in some cases, these companies are so large that the market doesn't bear 3 to 5% more capacity without them internally improving their logistics structure. So TMS is one of the tools that can, again, turn on the lights for these companies and give them the data and visibility to do what they need to do. And so TMS is definitely a tool. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all TMS approach to the industry. So I think every TMS application needs to be tailored to that industry-specific segment. I think a SaaS product is more applicable within certain industry segments, and a full managed 3PL offering is more apropos in others.
Talking about 3PLs and logistics service providers, historically, oil and gas, for many 3PLs really wasn't a focus industry, for them. But what we're seeing increased attention today by a number of 3PLs on oil and gas. In some ways, you've kind of already talked through this in terms of why the increased attention today. So maybe you can kind of underscore some of those reasons why, this is an area of focus now for service providers, and what capabilities or attributes should companies in the oil and gas industry look for in a logistics service provider?
Yeah, interesting question, and I think there's a couple different answers. If you look back 10 to 15 years, generally the logistics and trucking effort was led from the field by company men. And those company men were called on by trucking companies who were very niche specific and spoke these people's language. They worked in their geographies and knew how to specifically service them. What you did not see then was drive-in or specialized flatbed carriers who really played in the oil and gas area and then played in the auto area at the same time because it was so niche specific. With the growth in the United States, I think a lot of that onus moved back to places like Houston, where purchasing teams really started to evaluate regulatory, financial, and solutions-based offerings. And so the industry, I think, grew up a little bit in terms of its approach to sourcing, supply chain, logistics, and trucking services. And then, of course, with fracking and the awesome amount of material needed, these companies' trucking spend were quickly 10 times greater than they would have been 10 years ago.
No, that's a key. That's a key driver there. I mean, are you seeing, part of the driving force to look at logistics service providers, and perhaps one of the attributes to look for is is there a lack of talent in the industry, if you will, in terms of people within the oil and gas industry that understand kind of best practices in supply chain logistics, particularly from other industries, let's say, that can be applied to oil and gas to help them move up that maturity curve?
Yeah, another really spot question. I think traditionally some parts of the oil field were technology adverse in terms of logistics. And what I mean by that is you found people who said, well, this is the way we've always done it and it works. I don't necessarily want to call a carrier who may be a couple $100 cheaper, but they don't know what I do. They don't have the safety equipment that's necessary. They're going to ask me questions like, do we need pipe stakes or do we need to tarp the equipment, that I really don't have time to answer. I expect my carrier to come knowing what the job is. And so the market really awarded those carriers who had that knowledge and spoke those people's language and made it easy. I think there's a tremendous lack of supply chain specialty and logistics expertise in the area that's focused on solutions and new ways to do things. An interesting trend is our becoming more involved with positions in the biggest of the oil companies that are something like solutions improvement or business process. Generally, these are people who don't own a P&L but work internally to automate and push business improvement on different departments. And so that's really been an interesting and gratifying experience, because some of those people do speak our language. They quickly grasp what a TMS could do, how important a procurement event is, what benchmarking represents to them. And so that's a big game changer.
Great points. We're coming up short on time here, so let me kind of ask my last question here, kind of as a way to wrap up. So, so if I'm a oil and gas logistics, executive, what questions should I ask myself to determine whether, I'm best in class with regards to, my transportation logistics operations, or whether, there's areas for improvement?
Yeah, I think, believe it or not, the first question is, can you internally answer how much do I spend on transportation? Then can you answer how much do I spend on each mode? I would be very interested in seeing if that executive could answer what the impact of detention and demurrage is on their cost, and to really drive down into specific financial areas related to trucking. I think one of the things I challenge people with is simply, when was the last time you had a new solution or idea or plan for how to deal with your logistics or trucking program? Is it simply the same as it was 3 years ago?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because as we've talked about throughout the program here, this industry is very different today than it was 5 years ago, right? And if you look at everything going on from a regulatory standpoint, if you look at what's going on from the financial markets, what's going on with OPEC and kind of the world market now for oil and so forth, you can almost guarantee it's going to continue to change and evolve, moving forward. So I think that's a spot on question. So, Alaster, like I always say at the end of all my programs, we managed to just scratch the surface on this, but I think we certainly addressed some of the key points of what's happening in the oil and gas industry, and certainly it's an area that we're going to continue to keep a pulse on, and would welcome you back in the program sometime down the road to see what has changed and what new challenges and opportunities exist in the industry. So again, thank you very much for coming on the program today.
Thank you for the invitation, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate, and we'll be happy to field all questions you or anybody else has.
Great. And to that point, we didn't get any questions live today, but if you are watching this episode on demand, you can go ahead and find the episode on talkinglogistics.com, and you can post a question or a comment there for Alaster. I'm sure that he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. So with that, thank you very much for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.